It was the kind of summer that still lingered in the memory of small towns, hot, endless, filled with the hum of cicadas and the sound of screen doors slamming. In 1999, Amber Holt was 24 and already the sort of person who made people talk. She had a bright, quick smile, long dark hair, and a stubborn streak that had carried her straight through her parents' careful plans for her life. Her father was a local insurance man, her mother a Sunday school teacher, and they'd raised her to be polite, modest, and predictable. But Amber wanted something that felt real, something that wasn't wrapped in the suffocating quiet of the same 4 streets she'd grown up on. She found it in Dylan Reeves. He worked at the garage off Main Street, the kind of man who smelled of oil and cigarettes, with calloused hands and a voice that could switch from gentle to sharp in a heartbeat. People in town called him Trouble, not because he'd ever done anything serious, but because he didn't belong to anyone. He rented a small place out by the edge of town, drank too much on weekends, and never went to church. To Amber, he was everything her parents said to stay away from, and that made him impossible to resist. Their relationship started fast late-night drives down county roads, whispered promises outside her window, and arguments that ended in tears followed by laughter. Friends would later describe them as fire and gasoline. Everyone could see the chemistry. No one could see how quickly it could burn. By August, Amber had packed a single suitcase and told her parents she was moving out. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't even wait for the argument to finish before walking out the door. Her mother cried. Her father said she'd regret it. Amber told them she was tired of being told who to love. And that was the last time they saw her face. At first, life with Dylan seemed like the freedom she'd always wanted. They rented a small duplex near the industrial park, a world away from her parents' manicured house and tidy routines. The nights were filled with loud music, laughter, and cheap beer. She told friends she finally felt alive, but behind the excitement were signs of unease, bruises she covered with makeup, sudden silences when his name came up, and the way she sometimes flinched when her phone rang. Her co-workers at the diner began to notice changes too. She started showing up late. Her smile, once effortless, became something she had to remind herself to wear. She stopped talking about her dreams of studying nursing. Instead, she talked about keeping the peace. By early fall, the fights between Amber and Dylan had become a public thing. Neighbors reported shouting matches, slamming doors, and one night, a crash that sounded like furniture breaking. Yet, the next day, they'd be seen holding hands at the grocery store as if nothing had happened. Small towns learned to mind their own business. People told themselves they were just young and passionate. Then, one Monday morning, Amber didn't show up for her shift. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she'd quit without warning she'd done impulsive things before. But when the second day passed and her friends couldn't reach her, the worry started to spread. Her parents tried calling her number, and late that evening, they received a voicemail, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Her voice was shaking, angry, but it was her. "I'm done," she said. "I'm done trying to make you understand. This is my life now. Stop calling me." And then a pause, a deep breath. "Just know I'm okay." It was the last time anyone ever heard from her. The police were never called. Her parents, still hurt and confused, believed she'd chosen to cut them out completely. Dylan told anyone who asked that she'd left him, said she needed space. Maybe went to Houston to stay with a friend. No one could prove otherwise. Without a report, there was no file. Without a file, there was no case. Weeks turned into months. Her apartment's rent stopped being paid, and Dylan moved out by winter. He told the landlord she'd taken off and left her things behind. Some of her clothes were given away, the rest thrown out. The duplex was repainted and rented again. In a town where people vanish only in stories, Amber Holt became a whispered memory. Her parents waited for years, birthdays, holidays, the quiet dread of a phone that never rang. Every time the news mentioned an unidentified body somewhere in Texas, her mother would clip the article, her hands trembling, and keep it in a drawer, just in case. Her father tried to move on, but he never changed their old answering machine tape, still hoping to hear her voice one more time. Some nights, Neighbors saw the light in their living room flicker on at 3 a.m. They'd say her father was still up, listening to that last voicemail over and over. The years dulled the grief but never erased it. People forgot the details, the dates, the street she lived on, but not the unease. There was something unfinished about Amber's story, something that didn't fit the easy version people told themselves. A woman doesn't just disappear into the night without leaving a trace. And though the world had moved on, her absence never really left that town. It lived in the silences, in the way her name made people pause, in the locked drawer her father never opened. For 23 years, no one spoke of her out loud. But she was still there, somewhere between memory and guilt, waiting beneath the surface for someone to finally uncover what really happened the night she stopped being seen. Because Amber Holt hadn't left town at all. And the truth about where she'd gone was closer than anyone could have imagined. By the time 2022 came around, the Holt house had changed hands twice. The white paint had faded to gray, the rose bushes were long dead, and the mailbox still carried faint traces of the family's name, half sanded off by time. Inside, dust lingered in corners like a memory that refused to fade. Neighbors said it always felt heavy there, not haunted exactly, just unsettled. After Amber's disappearance in 1999, her parents had lived in that house together for another 7 years. Her mother, Lillian, never truly recovered. Every birthday she baked a small cake, set it on the table, and whispered a prayer that her daughter might somehow see the candlelight flickering through the kitchen window. Her father, Robert, went quiet. He'd once been a proud, steady man now. He moved through the house like a shadow. When Lillian passed in 2006, he buried her beside the empty plot they'd reserved for Amber, a space that had become both a promise and a punishment. He stayed in that home alone for 15 more years, living among boxes he never unpacked, photos he never took down, and a single voicemail tape that he kept in a drawer, the same message Amber had left the night she vanished. Every so often, he'd play it again just to hear her voice, to remind himself she was real. He told a neighbor once, "I think I'd rather never know than find out what really happened." When Robert passed away in 2021, the property went up for sale. It wasn't worth much. The house was outdated, the floors sagging, the walls lined with dark, water-stained wood paneling. A young couple from Austin, Mark and Elise Turner, bought it with plans to restore it and turn it into a rental. They weren't locals. To them, it was just another old fixer-upper in a quiet Texas town. They moved in that spring, excited and naive to what the house had held on to. The first few weeks were ordinary hauling boxes, painting, pulling up old carpet. Elise liked the original structure and insisted on keeping some of the house's character. But one afternoon in late May, as they began removing warped paneling in the den, Mark noticed something strange beneath the floorboards, near the back wall. Dark stains, irregular and deep, seeping through old wood. At first, he thought it was water damage, but the shape was wrong, almost circular in spots, and the smell, faint but distinct, wasn't mildew. It was metallic. They pried up a few planks, expecting to find rot. Instead, beneath the boards was a small cavity filled with dust, dirt, and fragments of something that glinted in the light. Elise crouched to look closer and saw a thin chain tangled around a rusted clasp, a locket, delicate and corroded, its hinges fused shut. She wiped the surface with her sleeve and noticed faint engraving, almost unreadable. But inside the grime, the initials A.H. could still be made out. That discovery stopped them cold. They found something else nearby, a compact mirror, cracked down the middle, the kind women carried in purses decades ago. On the inside, faint etching in the metal rim spelled Amber. Elise froze. She didn't know the story, not yet. But the house suddenly felt smaller, as if something beneath the floor had been holding its breath for years. They called the police. Within an hour, the quiet cul-de-sac filled with flashing lights and marked vehicles. The local sheriff's office cordoned off the property, while a crime scene unit carefully removed additional sections of flooring. Beneath the subfloor lay a patch of uneven soil, soft, disturbed. It looked like someone had dug there long ago and covered it hastily. As investigators worked through the night, rumors began to ripple through town. Someone mentioned the name Amber Holt, the girl who vanished back in '99. Someone else said the old man who lived there had been her father. By morning, the entire neighborhood was awake. Forensic specialists combed through every inch of the den. What they uncovered wasn't immediately clear to the public, but whispers began before sunrise. One officer, stepping out to his cruiser, was overheard saying quietly, "This isn't water damage." The discovery made the evening news. By the next day, remains possibly connected to decades-old missing woman found in local home renovation site. Reporters descended on the small town. Camera crews gathered at the edge of the yard while crime scene tape fluttered in the hot wind. To most people, it was just another tragic cold case unearthed by chance. But to the few who still remembered Amber Holt, her laughter, her defiance, the unanswered questions, it felt like a ghost finally forcing itself back into the world. Detectives reopened the long-dormant file, though there had never truly been one. Because Amber had never been officially reported missing, there was no case to reassign, only fragments, old statements from co-workers, a note from the family pastor, a line in a faded police log about domestic disturbance. No charges filed. It all came flooding back to the small department that had once overlooked it. Robert Holt's name reappeared in local memory, too. People remembered how he'd kept to himself, how he'd refused interviews, how he never sold the house even when he could barely afford it. Neighbors whispered that maybe he'd known something all along. But those who knew him better said no, he'd been broken by guilt, not haunted by secrets. Investigators focused on the new owner's discovery. The soil sample beneath the den was sent for analysis. The locket and mirror were documented, their corrosion suggesting they'd been underground for decades. When the ground was sifted, technicians found what they described as organic fragments, enough to warrant deeper excavation. The state crime lab was contacted, and within days, the remains of a human skeleton began to emerge. They were small-framed, partial, but clearly adult. And though the bones were degraded, a dental fragment matched the records found through Amber's old employer, a filling noted from a checkup in 1998. It was her. 23 years after she vanished, Amber Holt had been beneath her own family's home, buried in the very place she'd sworn she'd never return to. The shock rippled far beyond the town. For those who'd lived through the story, it reopened every question they'd buried along with her. How had she ended up there? Who put her there? And why had no one looked sooner? As forensic teams packed their equipment and loaded evidence into vans, neighbors stood behind their fences watching. The old Holt house, stripped down and silent again, seemed to exhale. For the first time in decades, the mystery wasn't hidden anymore. But as one detective quietly told a local reporter, "This isn't the end. It's just the start." Because buried with Amber Holt was something even more unsettling, a timeline that didn't add up, and a man who had once promised to love her, more than anyone else ever could. For days, the old Holt property looked less like a home and more like an excavation site. Bright yellow tape cut across the yard, and portable lights cast hard white shadows across the warped porch. Inside, every square foot was catalogued, photographed, and dusted for trace evidence. Detectives moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid that one wrong step might erase what Amber Holt had been trying to tell them for 23 years. The remains were lifted from beneath layers of plywood and subflooring, sealed away in what investigators later described as a makeshift cavity. Whoever had hidden her knew enough to keep it quiet. The space was lined with insulation, then patched and covered with new wood, concealing every sign of disturbance. Beneath it, a single skeletal frame lay curled inward, as though protecting itself. The scene was clinical, but those who worked it said something about it felt personal. Her locket, the one found by the new homeowners, still hung loosely around the deteriorated bone near where her chest would have been. Her shoes were missing. Her hair, preserved in small clumps, was found pressed into the soil beneath her skull. It was clear she hadn't been buried far. She had been sealed into the structure itself. Forensic specialists from the state crime lab arrived 2 days later, packaging the remains and transporting them for examination. DNA was extracted from a molar and sent to Austin for comparison against archived material provided by Robert Holt years earlier. The results returned in less than a week. The match was conclusive. The woman under the Holt house was indeed Amber. That confirmation changed everything. A homicide investigation officially opened on the 11th of June 2022, 23 years after Amber's disappearance. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of the house's modifications. They found building permit records from 2001, issued under the name Dylan Reeves Construction. The permits detailed subfloor repair and replacement due to moisture damage. It wasn't uncommon for small-scale contractors to register under personal names back then, especially for informal work. But the dates stood out. 2 years after Amber vanished, Dylan Reeves had personally overseen the installation of new flooring in her parents' den, the very space where her body had been hidden. Investigators tracked down Dylan easily. He was living in a neighboring county, remarried, and running a small auto repair business. By all accounts, his life was stable, unremarkable. When detectives showed up at his home one morning in July, he didn't appear surprised to see them. They told him they were revisiting Amber Holt's disappearance. He nodded, said he'd heard something about that on the news. When asked about his relationship with her, he described it as volatile, on and off, said she'd left him after an argument and never came back. When the detectives told him her remains had been found, his reaction was muted. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the ground, and asked if they were sure. He claimed he had no idea what happened to her, that she'd walked out one night with a duffel bag and told him not to follow. At first, it sounded like a story rehearsed too many times. Back at the sheriff's office, investigators began pulling everything they could on Dylan Reeves. Old employment records showed he'd been laid off from his job at a construction supply company in late 1999. Around the same month, Amber vanished. A few months later, he'd filed to start a small contracting business. Among his earliest projects, home repairs and flooring installations. One name on his client list was Robert Holt. Detectives found a single invoice handwritten on carbon paper, dated June 2001. Labor den subfloor replacement, material disposal. The handwriting was blocky, unsteady. On the back of the same page, faint impressions from a previous note bled through what appeared to be a list: paneling, screws, adhesive, bleach. The theory forming inside the investigation room was grim. Dylan had killed Amber sometime in the fall of 1999, possibly after an argument that turned violent. Her body hadn't been disposed of immediately. It had been hidden temporarily, maybe in his garage or shed. When the opportunity came 2 years later to work on the Holt home, he used it. He had access, knowledge of the structure, and a reason to be there unsupervised. The lab results provided the first physical evidence of how she'd died. The skull displayed a single linear fracture across the left parietal bone, a clean, forceful impact consistent with a blunt instrument, possibly a hammer or heavy tool. The edges showed no signs of healing. It had been an instantaneous fatal strike. The medical examiner's report was cold and precise. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. Manner of death: homicide. It took investigators weeks to piece together a fuller picture. They interviewed former neighbors, co-workers, even Dylan's current wife, who said he'd once told her about a girl who ran out on him, and how people in town never let it go. He'd insisted Amber had a temper, that she was unstable, that her leaving had nearly ruined him. But behind those words, detectives saw what years of avoidance had built a life carefully constructed on top of something buried. In interviews, people who had known Amber described fear more than instability. A waitress friend recalled seeing her with bruises she couldn't explain. Another mentioned how she'd once come to work shaking after Dylan allegedly smashed her phone during an argument. Yet at the time, no one reported it. It was the late 90s, in a small town, where domestic disputes stayed behind closed doors. Detectives combed through photographs of the original house interior, stored in county property archives. In one image taken in 2000 for insurance purposes, a faint discoloration appeared along the den's baseboard. It had been covered in later years. They sent it to a forensic analyst, who confirmed the pattern was consistent with blood seepage through wood grain before sealing. That small detail, unnoticed for decades, became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence in the case. When confronted again, Dylan's calm began to falter. Detectives asked him directly why his name appeared on the renovation permits for the Holt home. He hesitated, said Robert Holt had trusted him to fix the floors, that it was a side job, but the idea that a grieving father would hire his missing daughter's boyfriend to remodel his house strained belief. And when investigators pressed further, asking why he'd chosen to replace floorboards that weren't visibly damaged, he had no answer. He tried to retreat behind silence, saying he didn't want to talk without an attorney. But by then, his story was already cracking. Back at the crime lab, technicians identified trace residues embedded in the old flooring materials that had been removed from the house. Among the chemical compounds were remnants of bleach and solvent, the kind used to dissolve organic stains. Under spectroscopic analysis, the fibers contained microscopic blood protein traces matching Amber's DNA profile. It was enough to reclassify the case as a targeted domestic homicide. For the first time, Amber Holt was not just a missing person, she was a confirmed victim of murder. The announcement sent shockwaves through the small Texas town that had once written her off as just another runaway. News outlets revisited her story, headlines pairing her smiling photo with the grim discovery beneath her childhood home. Old friends who'd moved away began posting online, recounting memories, regrets, the warning signs they'd missed. The sheriff's office prepared an affidavit outlining probable cause for Dylan Reeves's involvement. Though circumstantial, the evidence painted a chillingly coherent picture: the timing of his renovations, the forensic link to the house, and his history of violence. The case that had once been defined by silence was now echoing louder than ever. And yet, there were still unanswered questions: how he managed to hide her there, whether anyone else had known, and what exactly happened that night in 1999, when Amber Holt disappeared from the face of the earth. Detectives believed Dylan Reeves was ready to talk, but what he would eventually reveal would unravel the story even further, exposing not just a murder, but a desperate cover-up that had lived quietly beneath the floorboards of a grieving family's home for over 2 decades. Sometimes it isn't the crime itself that haunts you, it's the love story buried underneath. And Amber's wasn't the only one. There was a couple, who disappeared together on what was supposed to be the happiest week of their lives. For 12 years, no one knew where they went, until a drone captured something no human eye ever had. That case is linked below if you want to see how eerily similar it feels. The more detectives uncovered about Amber Holt's final days, the harder it became to reconcile the story Dylan Reeves had been telling for 23 years. He still insisted she'd left him voluntarily, that she was impulsive, dramatic, prone to running off when things got heated. But the people who had actually known Amber painted a very different picture, one of a young woman who had been scared, isolated, and trying to find a way out long before she vanished. Over several weeks, investigators began retracing her last known steps. They spoke to former co-workers at the diner where she'd waitressed, old friends from church, even a cousin she'd briefly stayed with before moving in with Dylan. Each conversation added a new layer of unease. One friend remembered how Amber would show up to work wearing long sleeves in the middle of summer, claiming she'd burned herself with a curling iron. Another recalled how her laughter had changed, quieter, hesitant, like she was constantly gauging whether it was safe to smile. One woman, a waitress named Carla, said Amber had confided in her not long before she disappeared. "She told me she was going to leave him," Carla told detectives. Said she'd been saving up, had a bag packed. She just needed a few days to figure out where to go. When asked if Amber mentioned being afraid, Carla hesitated before nodding. She said he watched her too closely, like, even when he wasn't in the room. Detectives found similar echoes in nearly every interview. The couple's arguments were well known around town, fights that spilled into parking lots, neighbors calling to complain about shouting late at night. One of those neighbors, an older man named Richard Sutton, lived in the unit next to theirs back in 1999. When detectives tracked him down, he seemed startled that anyone was still asking about Amber after all this time. He remembered that week clearly. There had been yelling, then silence, then strangely hammering. Late, around 2 in the morning, he said. A steady pounding, not construction work, not random, like someone was building or fixing something. I figured maybe he was repairing a wall they'd damaged, but after that night, I never saw her again. Sutton's statement was entered into evidence. Combined with the autopsy's findings, a blunt force impact to the skull, the sound of hammering took on a chilling new meaning. Investigators continued digging into Dylan Reeves's employment history. At the time Amber vanished, he'd been working for a small construction outfit just outside of town. Payroll records showed he took a sudden, unexplained leave for 9 days in September 1999, the same period Amber went missing. His supervisor from that era, a man named Carl Jennings, told police that Dylan had called in for personal reasons and returned looking exhausted, thinner, and jumpy. He said he was dealing with relationship stuff, Jennings recalled. I remember telling him to sort his life out before coming back to work. I never asked more questions than that. It was a common refrain, no one had asked more questions. Detectives began reviewing financial records, hoping to tie Dylan to any purchases that might connect him to the scene. It didn't take long. Buried among old transactions was a receipt from a local hardware store dated the 14th of September 1999, 3 days after Amber's last voicemail to her parents. The items purchased were simple but telling: flooring adhesive, plywood sheets, nails, and a gallon of industrial-strength bleach. The signature on the receipt matched his. When confronted with it during questioning, Dylan's carefully maintained calm began to falter. He shifted in his seat, claiming he couldn't remember that specific purchase, that he'd done lots of small jobs back then. But when detectives pointed out that the listed address for the delivery was his own duplex, he went silent. The investigators pressed harder, walking him through the timeline, asking about the late-night hammering neighbors had reported, the missing days from work, the permit filed 2 years later for flooring installation at the Holt home. For the first time, he broke eye contact. His answers came slower, softer, like someone trying to piece together a story he no longer believed. They noticed something else. Whenever Amber's name was spoken aloud, he'd tighten his jaw, his breathing shallow. One detective later said it was the look of a man reliving something he'd buried for too long. As the case deepened, the psychological portrait of Dylan Reeves came into sharper focus. He had always been described as charming, magnetic, even. People said he had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room when he spoke. But those closest to him described a darker undercurrent: quick temper, obsessive jealousy, the kind of quiet control that didn't leave bruises until it was too late. Amber, according to those who knew her best, had spent months trying to balance love with fear, convinced she could fix him if she just stayed. Her diary, recovered from a box of old belongings her parents had kept in storage, told the same story. The entries started full of excitement, plans to move in together, dreams of starting over. But as the months went on, the tone shifted. "He gets angry when I talk to anyone else," one line read. "Says I embarrass him when I look away during arguments." In another, she wrote, "I think if I leave, he'll come after me." The final entry, dated just a week before she disappeared, said simply, "I'm packing tonight. I'll tell him tomorrow." That small notebook became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case, a window into the days before everything unraveled. Forensic analysis of the old duplex where they'd lived was impossible. Years had passed, tenants had come and gone, and every surface had been replaced. But detectives managed to track down archived photographs taken by the landlord in 2000 after Dylan moved out. In one image, a faint outline on the wall above the baseboard looked darker than the surrounding paint. When enhanced, it revealed an irregular stain, small, circular. The location matched where Amber's head would have struck had she fallen or been pushed near the hallway leading to the bedroom. When confronted again, Dylan's composure finally cracked. He tried to deflect, saying Amber had provoked him, that they'd argued constantly, that he'd lost control but hadn't meant to hurt her. "It was an accident," he muttered, staring down at his hands. He claimed she fell, that he panicked, that he didn't know what else to do. But the story didn't hold. The fracture in her skull had been clean, concentrated, deliberate. Investigators didn't rush him. They let the silence sit heavy in the room until he finally whispered, almost to himself, "You don't understand." She wasn't supposed to leave. That single sentence told them more than hours of questioning ever could. To outsiders, it had been a love story gone wrong. To those who looked closer, it was a slow suffocation disguised as devotion, a woman trying to escape a man who refused to let her exist outside his reach. The more detectives studied Dylan Reeves, the clearer it became that Amber's disappearance wasn't spontaneous. It was the endpoint of control, a final act of ownership. He'd taken everything from her, the choice to leave, the chance to live, and then buried her beneath the one place she could never escape from again. The evidence against him was mounting. The hardware receipt, the leave from work, the renovation permit, the neighbor's testimony, the bruise patterns described by her friends, and the journal entries that chronicled her fear. It was all converging toward one truth. But before prosecutors could move forward, they needed a confession that tied the evidence together. And when Dylan Reeves was finally cornered with nowhere else to turn, what he admitted in that small interrogation room would change the entire understanding of what really happened inside that house. He hadn't just killed Amber Holt. He'd hidden her where he knew no one would ever look, under the floors of the home her parents prayed she'd return to. And what he said next revealed a secret even darker than anyone had imagined. By the time Dylan Reeves finally spoke, the weight of silence had already turned into something heavier than denial. He'd been in the interrogation room for nearly 6 hours, hands folded, eyes fixed on a single crack in the table's veneer. Outside, the hallway hummed with muted conversation, the kind that fills police stations when the truth is circling closer. He knew they had him. Detectives had built the case piece by piece: Amber's remains, the flooring permit, the blood traces, the receipts. There was nowhere left for his story to hide. When he finally leaned back and exhaled, it wasn't the sound of surrender. It was relief, like a man who'd been waiting years to stop pretending. He began slowly, his voice flat, detached, as if reciting something he'd told himself so many times that it had lost all texture. He said things had been hard back then: money problems, pressure, constant fighting. He said Amber had wanted more than he could give her. She'd been restless, talking about moving out, about getting a job somewhere new, maybe even going back to school. He'd felt her slipping away. "I couldn't handle it," he said quietly. "I thought if she left, that'd be it. I'd lose everything." The detectives didn't interrupt. They just let him speak. That night he couldn't remember the exact date. Maybe mid-September, he said. They'd argued after dinner. He'd found a bag she'd packed under the bed, clothes, a small envelope of cash, and her mother's rosary. It confirmed what he already feared. She was leaving. He'd confronted her. Words turned to shouting. She'd told him she was done, that she was going to her parents' house in the morning. He remembered her standing near the bedroom door, telling him to let her go. He said he reached out to stop her, that she turned to pull away. The details after that blurred together. "It was an accident," he said again. "I didn't mean for her to fall." The forensic report said otherwise. He described how she hit the corner of the wall, how the sound was nothing like in movies, how she didn't move afterward. He said he panicked. He didn't call anyone, didn't try to hide what he'd done right away, either. He just sat on the floor beside her body, waiting for her to breathe again. He said hours passed before it sank in that she wouldn't. Detectives later wrote that his tone never rose above a whisper. He spoke of her death as though it had happened to both of them at once. By morning, he said, he was thinking only of survival. He wrapped her in a sheet, placed her in the trunk of his car, and drove around for hours, unsure what to do. He claimed he even parked near the edge of the county line once, thinking of leaving her off the road, but couldn't go through with it. "I kept seeing her face," he said. "Every time I stopped the car, I saw her sitting up in the rear view." When detectives asked how she ended up under the Holt house, his explanation came haltingly. A few days after her death, he'd driven past the neighborhood where her parents lived. The house was empty. Robert and Lillian were away visiting relatives. He knew this because Amber had mentioned it earlier that week. He said something and him snapped. It felt right, he said, like bringing her home. He'd gone to the hardware store, bought plywood, nails, and bleach. That same night, he broke into the house using a spare key Amber had kept. He carried her body through the back door, careful not to wake the neighbors, and laid her in the den. Then, over several hours, He dug a shallow space beneath the floorboards, sealed her inside, and covered the opening as if nothing had happened. "I just kept working," he said. "I couldn't stop. I had to make it look perfect." For years, he believed he'd succeeded. The detectives recorded every word. They didn't rush him, didn't correct the lies that hung inside the truths. But one of them asked why he'd gone back 2 years later to replace the flooring again, even after the house had already been sold to another owner. Dylan hesitated for the first time. His hands started to shake. He said the boards had started to shift, the soil sinking beneath them. Maybe. He'd been afraid someone would notice. So, in 2001, when the property was listed for renovation, he'd offered his services through his new contracting business. He said he told himself it was just to fix the floor. But once inside, he'd taken extra care to seal it permanently. In that moment, every line of his life since 1999 came into focus. The years spent building homes for other people, the quiet suburbs he never stayed in for long, the silence he maintained about Amber's name. His work had been both punishment and disguise. When the detectives showed him photos of her recovered remains, what was left of her necklace, the locket he'd once given her, he didn't look away. He just nodded slowly, then asked if they'd found the bag. They hadn't known about a bag. He said she'd packed one that night, the one that started the fight. It had cash, clothes, and that rosary. "If you find that," he said softly, "you'll know I'm telling the truth." The next day, crime scene technicians returned to the property. Following his statement, they searched the attic space above the den and found a compact, dust-covered shape buried deep inside the insulation. It was a small duffel bag, fabric decayed but intact. Inside were faded clothes, a roll of cash, and a silver rosary wrapped around the strap. Her attempt at freedom had been there all along, only a few feet above where her body lay. When investigators brought him the photos, Dylan didn't speak. He just closed his eyes. The confession was everything the prosecution needed, an unbroken chain of guilt tied together by detail, evidence, and the absence of remorse. But to those who had followed the case for decades, it was more than that. It was a revelation of how ordinary cruelty can masquerade as love, how control can disguise itself as protection until there's nothing left but fear. Detective said his final words, before being taken back to his cell, were quiet, almost inaudible. "She was trying to leave," he said, "and I couldn't let her." For the first time in 23 years, the story of Amber Holt was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy, told by the man who created it. The silence that had hung over her family, her town, and her name had finally been broken, but in the telling, it revealed something even more devastating. Because beneath every truth Dylan Reeves confessed was another, darker one that lingered in the air after he stopped talking. If no one had found that locket, if no one had lifted those floorboards, then he might have carried her secret to his grave, and Amber Holt might have remained just another name on a missing persons list, waiting for someone to remember she ever existed at all. When the trial ended, the courthouse emptied quietly, as if everyone inside knew that no verdict could really balance what had been lost. Dylan Reeves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His confession had been enough. There was no plea for sympathy, no explanation left to offer. The truth was out now, and the town that had once whispered Amber Holt's name only in fragments found itself saying it again, this time in mourning. The weeks that followed were strangely still. News crews left, police tape came down, and the old Holt property, once crawling with investigators, stood alone again. The den had been restored, the hole beneath the floor sealed forever, but no one wanted to live there. For a while, the house just sat, a hollow structure filled with memories that didn't belong to anyone anymore. When the date for Amber's reinterment was announced, people came from miles away. Some had gone to school with her. Others had barely known her but had carried the guilt of forgetting. The cemetery was small, the kind with wind-worn stones and uneven grass, bordered by the same oak trees that had shaded the Holt family for generations. The service was simple, no music, no speeches, just a soft prayer and the sound of wind moving through leaves. Amber's father, Robert Holt, now 74 and walking with a cane, stood by the gravesite longer than anyone else. He'd lived long enough to see the question that haunted him finally answered. but it hadn't brought peace. For years, he'd imagined 100 endings for his daughter, none as cruel as the one the truth delivered. He didn't cry. He just stared at the coffin, smaller than anyone expected it to be, and whispered something only he could hear. Then, carefully, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object, a gold locket, polished and restored, the same one found under the floor of the old house. He placed it gently on the lid, his hand lingering for a moment before stepping back. A photographer from the local paper captured that moment, the old man's trembling hand, the glint of the locket in sunlight. The photo ran the next morning with a single line beneath it, what remained beneath. After the funeral, the town began to change in quiet ways. For some, Amber's case became a warning, a reminder that love, when built on control, can turn deadly. For others, it reopened old wounds. Women who had once stayed silent about the men who frightened them began talking to one another. Churches held community vigils for victims of domestic violence. The sheriff's department started a new unit for cold cases. And on the corner near the diner where Amber used to work, someone left flowers every week without fail. No one knew who. The investigation had ended, but the echoes of it lingered everywhere, in the old photos on diner bulletin boards, in the whispers between neighbors, in the way people glanced at houses that felt too quiet at night. Robert visited her grave every Sunday. He rarely spoke to anyone there, just sat on the bench near the headstone that now bore both her name and her mother's. Sometimes he'd talk softly, updating them on the weather, the town, or how the flowers he'd planted were taking root. Other times, he just sat in silence, eyes fixed on the ground. He told a pastor once that he didn't believe in closure. "You don't close something like this," he said. "You just learn how to carry it quieter." In time, the town carried it too. Amber's story faded from headlines, but not from memory. The young couple who had discovered her remains eventually sold the Holt house, unable to live with what they'd uncovered. The property changed owners again, then stood vacant. And sometimes, in late summer, when the heat pressed down heavy, neighbors swore they could still smell bleach in the air near the den windows. In the end, Amber Holt was buried beside her mother, under the same patch of Texas sky where she'd once dreamed of escape. The locket stayed with her this time, its hinges cleaned and its clasp repaired, resting on her chest, like it was meant to be there all along. Her father passed away 2 years later. His headstone sits beside hers now, the 3 names aligned, the family whole again in the only way it could be. What remains of her story isn't written in case files or news reports, it lives in the spaces people overlook. The locked doors, the ignored bruises, the quiet neighbors who hear something and decide it's not their business. The lesson Amber left behind wasn't about mystery or justice. It was about how easily love can turn to silence and how truth sometimes waits decades to be found. Because the thing that hid beneath those floorboards wasn't just a body, it was a reminder that sometimes the darkness we fear most doesn't live in strangers or shadows. It lives inside the walls we trust. And for 23 years, it waited there, patient and still, until the world was finally ready to listen.